All right, this is going to be a video about a topic that I didn't really want to make a video about. Nelson Mandela in South Africa is a region and a person that I don't know very much about. I know hardly anything about the biography of Nelson Mandela. And although South Africa stands out as perhaps the most interesting country in that entire continent, say perhaps Egypt because of its antiquity, um, I would characterize my knowledge of that place as falling into the Wikipedia category. I've read articles over a long time. It's not like I don't know anything, but it's not a country that I've really hit and systematically gone through all of its history in a way that I've done with many other places. I know more than your average person, but not that much more. My interest, by the way, was initially with the Zulus. I saw this film, Zulu, Michael Caine's first movie, probably when I was maybe 11, and it's one of the, I think, 3 movies that I have on VHS, DVD, and Blu-ray. It's an excellent movie. I highly recommend it, and although it is about a historical event and fairly accurate to that event, it's only a 48-hour period or something, in 1872, I think, February 1879, excuse me, and that doesn't really teach you about the history of South Africa. Now, I watched the docudrama, I think very much inspired by Roots, about Shaka. I read about Shaka, but Zulu history is not synonymous with South African history. The only book that I've read about South Africa isn't, again, a history book or anything along those lines. It's a book that I believe I read about in Norman Finkelstein book, and that was The Unspoken Alliance, Israel's Secret Relationship with Apartheid South Africa, this book right here, which I read earlier this year. And although this talks a decent amount about some of the policies of South Africa, it's mostly as in a way to kind of juxtapose and parallel it with the racist anti-Palestinian policies of Israel. It's mostly about the allegation that the likely allegation that the two countries cooperated in a nuclear arms program. Um, After apartheid ended, it sort of came out that the South African government had developed nuclear weapons, and at whatever point the de Klerk government realized that they were going to have to step down from power and give power over to the ANC, they dismantled these weapons. There's also interesting theories that I think are going to be relevant to what I talk about later, that the white Afrikaan or Boer military of South Africa retained some of these nukes, and that might explain some of the things that have happened subsequently. That's a theory. I don't know that that's true. It would strike me as odd if a state would literally actually dismantle its nukes. The estimate is that they probably had less than 10. Just real briefly on that book, Israel, of course, wants nuclear weapons. It's open secret that they possess them. Israel's problem is that they don't have access to a lot of fissile material, and South Africa has a ton. South Africa is the Saudi Arabia of minerals, people have said. If you look at things like gold and silver, platinum, it's usually in the 80% of the world product comes from there. I think it's like 90% of all the gold that's on the surface right now has been mined from South Africa since 1890 or whatever. Not to mention diamonds and a whole host of other minerals, including uranium, and there's evidence that they cooperated to some degree or another, maybe even did a test. But as interesting as that is, it doesn't tell you a ton about the politics of apartheid South Africa, certainly not about anything about Mandela. Um, from what I know, and I could be very wrong about this, uh, Mandela is, this member of the ANC. From what I can tell, the ANC is an absolutely ridiculously terrible political party, uh, totally unworthy of consideration on any grounds except the relative something else is worse, and the ANC isn't as bad as that, so it's good. And I don't see that. And if we're comparing it to South African apartheid regime, I don't even there see as coming out favorably. In terms of Mandela and terrorism, it's my understanding, this is just totally based on a very superficial look at it, that the ANC, although they didn't engage in terrorism, made a point to not try and kill civilians. Now, maybe they didn't do this. Maybe they were not capable of doing this. But I can't really blame Mandela if that happened while he was in prison. In Molyneux's video, he made a lot of, well, he gave birth to this organization and then it went on to kill people. That's, I mean, he's in prison. I don't know what else he could have done. Not to make an excuse for him, just like I don't follow the logic there, you know, necessarily. But I think what's interesting about the whole thing, um, as far as statists go, Mandela is certainly not the worst, not by a long shot. But I think there's an interesting reason as to why that is. And if you ever watch the movie, what is it, Invictus? Is that the one with Matt Damon? Um, there's a scene where Morgan Freeman, aka Nelson Mandela, says something. Um, he's trying to console the ANC, sports league is trying to end, rugby or whatever, and they're basically, we're in power now. We're gonna stick it to these white people. And what he says essentially, and he may never have said this, but the logic is, I think, accurate. So even if he never said it, if he was smart, he probably thought it. And nothing I've heard is that he's an idiot, so he probably would have realized this. Look, they control the military, they control the police, they have most of the wealth. If they feel threatened, if they feel upset enough, they will fight back. And that is a physical restraint on how much extortion they can do. And I'm not, what happens in Africa, in South Africa now, is pretty atrocious. And I've heard all about the murdering of the farmers. There's Afrikaner, Boer, YouTubers on here complain about it all the time. I've watched, I don't know how many documentaries with Terry Blanchett, the former head of their right-wing party, who was himself murdered not that long ago, actually, just maybe a year or two. I understand that, but they're not going, and say in Zimbabwe, you don't have nearly enough whites, and they can get, Robert Mugabe can do whatever he wants to them, essentially. South Africa, there's what, 3-4 million of them. I think they're steadily leaving from that terrible country, but you can't expropriate them as directly as you might otherwise. And this is kind of where the possibility of a nuke exists. It wouldn't surprise me at all if some segment of the military just said, okay, we're going to keep these nukes, and don't go full on communist, anti-white, or whatever, or else. Now, even if they don't have nukes, just the threat of their active resistance is enough. But I think the more interesting thing here is the veneration of Mandela is just a reflection of the values of the politically correct society that we're in, which venerates and extols the virtues of pluralism and multiculturalism, and puts that on a higher pedestal than anything else. So, and it's even more clear in the defamation against racists. So as much as they praise Mandela, it's more a reflection of, because apartheid is bad. And I agree, apartheid is bad. I'm a free marketer, and I don't think that you should have rules like that. But of all the terrible things in the world, apartheid and just racism that only is to the point of it's just racism and it's not, active mass homicide, it's not that bad relative to those other things. And if we look at Africa, there's plenty of places we can look around where there's mass homicide. And people have kind of pointed out, oh, look, the colonial countries, they did all kinds of mass homicide against blacks in other countries. And the worst example that I know of is, and it's a good book if you want to read about it, was in what is today the Democratic Republic of Congo, but which forever was called Zaire. This is King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, which, by the way, was also referenced in a Norman Finkelstein book. So I got both of these books after reading one of his books. I think I read The Holocaust Industry, or maybe Myth and Reality, Israel and Palestine, something like that. Both of them were referenced in that. This is a really good book about the Belgian colonization, really the private colonization by this single monarch that most people have never heard of. who is reputed, the number is about 10 million people in Zaire were killed, largely actually shot over the course of maybe 20 years, around the turn of the century. That's the worst one I've heard about. There are others, some of the German colonization, say in Namibia against the Hottentots or in Tanzania. They wiped out a couple tribes. Of course, they were small tribes, so the total numbers killed would have been in the tens of thousands, not in the millions or hundreds of thousands. Um, which, okay, that's pretty horrible too. Actually, Azar Gott talks about those in his book. That's actually where I've heard most about them. In South Africa itself, um, I'm not familiar with mass killings of blacks by whites. The only mass killings that I'm familiar with in South Africa were Zulus slaughtering competing tribes like the Andwandwe and some of the other groups. There is evidence of massive genocide, probably falling into the millions during the state building time of Shaka Zulu, to the point where 40, 50 years later, people are finding mountains of skulls, that sort of thing. There's probably some hyperbole there, but from all the evidence we have, there was a massive democide committed by the Zulus against competing groups. I don't know that anything comparable was done by the Boers or subsequently by the English. The English were not that bloody typically. I hate saying that because they were so big that when they did do things, it tended to be bad. Um, so correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone knows better. The other thing is, and I've heard this, well, they stole their land. A lot of the blacks in South Africa are not native blacks. They're not the Joja or the Zulu or any of the indigenous groups. They're Bantus who immigrated there from other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and they were drawn there because they thought it was a better option to be there than wherever they happened to be from. I don't see how those groups could then say, oh, we emigrated here because it was preferable to any place else, and now we hate all you white people because you drew us here in the first place. There's a really good, interesting documentary that was made by an Italian film crew during the 60s, during the period when European colonization of Europe was largely ending. Of course, it started in the 50s. Sometimes it lasted until the 70s. Portugal was pretty much the last country to kind of get out in a big way. During the 60s, that's when England and France and Belgium were done, and they started to mass pull out, and you just had this teeter-totter of all these countries becoming free, but not South Africa. South Africa wasn't a colony because South Africa was self-governing as part of the English Dominion, and the documentary is mostly about the transition, what's happening. But they made a point to juxtapose, because at the time, this is the apogee of apartheid. This is when racist South Africa, and it is racist, and look, we can criticize that all day, justifiably. But my point is, compare that to what was happening in other places in Africa that you've never heard about, because the one thing people have heard about is the Rwanda genocide. Now, I think that was an area that was ruled by the Dutch, or not, excuse me, not the Dutch, the Belgians. It's adjacent to Zaire. And typical of European colonization attempts, they took one local group who were pastoralists, the Tutsis, and had them basically minister the majority of the people who were mostly Hutus, although there obviously would have been even other groups. After, liberation, you get political parties based on those two groups, and eventually the Hutus, not all of them, a group within the Hutus decide, we don't really like the Tutsis, we want to exterminate them. Now, the first people they killed were moderate Hutus. The first people who died in that genocide were the Hutus who would have opposed that. And then they went about annihilating as many Tutsis as possible. And everyone's familiar with this, and you hear 800,000 killed by machetes, blah, blah, blah. What people don't realize is that stuff similar to that, if not always equal to that in scale, repeated itself many, many times in post-colonial Africa. And the documentary is interesting because it actually shows some of that. Very, very heart-wrenching, moving scenes of them going along the coast of what's today Tanzania, in areas where the majority is black African. There's a substantial Arab minority that's commercial and has more political power than their population would tend to indicate. And just gripping scenes where they fly over a beach and just hundreds or thousands of Arabs are clawing to any boat, any craft that they can to flee. And then they fly back the next day and it's strewn with corpses. And then they went to South Africa and they showed, the Zulus, living in middle class, is it great? Is it paradise? No, but they have jobs, they have money, they have appliances, and it's like, what's worse? The racist two-tier Jim Crow system, which did kill people. I mean, we're not going to pretend apartheid doesn't have blood on its hand. It does. But does it compare to, the post-colonial genocides, or for that matter, the colonial genocides? I don't think so. And it's kind of a indication of where the normative weight is being put. And I think there's a reason, because racism is ultimately very kind of subjective at a certain level. Beyond a certain point, it's very hard to prove. And if you demonize it hard enough, though, you just always have to defer to, well, racism's so bad. And we're to the point where, if you even say Obamacare, it's racist. If you say anything bad about the president, it's racist. If you say anything bad about the government or federal power, it's racist. I mean, if you say, oh, I don't think the government should run healthcare, people are like, oh, Jim Crow, blah, 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 blah. And for that logic to work, for that narrative to be effective, people who can be perceived as being anti-racism have to be lauded as, the greatest saints of our civic religion, and people who are racist have to be demonized as the worst. So that's why Hitler is worse than the communists, and that's why Mandela is such a great guy. Now, I don't even know if Mandela deserves the moniker of being, this pluralistic, multicultural guy. I don't know if he's racist. I don't know. They realize there's rational ignorance, and so there isn't a need to have it really be a totally true. Maybe he did the tire collar for a few people, but who's going to really know? He doesn't have that rep, and so they can just put him on a pedestal and say, look, he's anti-racist and he's the best person. If all the people we laud are anti-racist, and then all the people that are racist we cast as the worst, and so apartheid South Africa is the worst country ever, even relative to, Tutsi Rwanda, or in Tanzania, or Idi Amin in Uganda, or any number of other examples, then the liberal argument kind of makes itself. It's unnecessary to argue. You can just divide people into these two camps and say, oh, you're in the evil camp and you're in the good camp. And then if you're in the good camp, it doesn't matter if you're wrong or what you're doing is destructive. You're well-intentioned. You're in the good camp. If you're in the evil camp, it doesn't matter how logical it is, how right it is, how good the argument is, what your intentions are. You're in the evil camp. Boom, that's it. And in the United States, we have the South and the North and the federal government and the state governments. For some absurd reason, the federal government gets to be like the anti-racist part of government, which is just blows my mind that people can accept that so willingly. But it's just because they're fed that narrative, which is only partially true. And the same, we look at Africa, of all the terrible things, if we're going to talk about terrible things, we have a lot to pick from in Africa. And maybe the most terrible racist things are Europeans on black, like this guy. But I don't hear people talking about him. You hear about South Africa, apartheid South Africa, but at this point it's even a crushed. They're condemning white people who were born after apartheid and saying you blah blah blah, and then excusing homicide and rape. And look, I'm not saying, look, when you bring it up, people are just like, well, that's just the legacy of apartheid, and it's like, no, okay, you can't have you can't have incentives like that where people get a free pass because of something that happened that far back. Sorry, and so I think that's the interesting thing about Mandela. The specifics about his life, I don't know, and as far as I can tell, like he doesn't fall really far either way on the spectrum. I don't think he's super evil compared to other people. I don't think he's a super good guy. And I think a lot of the restraint, people say, why didn't he take revenge? I think a lot of that is explained by the fact that the people he would take revenge from could have killed him. He could have been coup d'etat at probably any time if he was perceived as that threatening. It doesn't matter that the blacks are a majority. And this is a thing that's often ignored. I remember when that happened, and they were showing, mass marches in the streets. And I remember seeing people with shields and axes and machetes. I'm like, what the hell's going on? And of course, the impression is it's the blacks, opposed to the whites. Not true. Um, Within the blacks, there's many different groups, and they are not all mutually agreeable to each other or unified. The Zulus, who I referenced earlier, apparently had something of a better deal relative to the other blacks in South Africa, probably because of the fact that they resisted. This is similar to the Boers. I mean, the Boers had their own states. They fought 2 wars with the British. The second one, which they lost, but was very hard fought, the Second Boer War, which, by the way, was a war that supposedly introduced many things like concentration camps and that sort of thing. Even though they lost, the British realized, look, we can either keep fighting these people or we can get them into the fold. And so the concessions that were involved basically meant that within 15, 20 years, South Africa was de facto independent anyway, despite the fact of just losing a war against the British. Similar with the Zulus, they fought very hard and they were given concessions as a result. And they had, I guess, again, I'm not an expert on South Africa, a better position relative to other blacks in that society. And they didn't want to see their their rent seeking abolished. And they were antagonistic toward the ANC. I can understand being antagonistic to the ANC. I hate the ANC. Like, not like, I mean, has it done as bad as a lot of other parties? No, because it just has never had that kind of power. Does its policies that it actually wants, are they quite as terrible as all the other ones? No, but how is that a ringing endorsement? Like, and I don't even know if I can compare its bad policies with the de Klerk government or the apartheid regime and say, oh yeah, one is better than the other. I don't like either. I think that the condemnation of one and the laudation placed on the other is more an indication of political sensibilities and historical narrative than it is about fact. You know, uh, Racism good, bad, pluralism maybe, just let's assume, well, he's black, he can't be racist, right? Is good, and then he stands out, and look, he's photogenic, and it's kind of like Barack Obama, like he just fits. He's an easy guy to put on a pedestal for those reasons. You got to look closely, and he doesn't have the most glaring flaws. Someone's going to comment here about all the terrible things he did. Fine, just compare that to FDR, and it doesn't compare. You know, or this guy, or Stalin, or Mugabe. It doesn't really compare. And it's this kind of the end of history, the progression of history, and he's just one of those people. And then people focus, and then the reality becomes based on the pedestal, the fantasy, the myth, the mythos, this Greek statue. And it's not just Mandela, it's FDR, and it's MLK, and it's Abraham Lincoln. I mean, literally in stone in his case, and a few others. You take a historical figure, you kind of ignore important aspects of them, maybe even the truth, and you just ignore that. You make up certain parts that fits your narrative, and then you cast that in bronze or stone or whatever, and then you build your civic religion on that, on a whole bunch of myths, because you can't build a civic religion on like reality. You can't build religion on reality. It doesn't make any sense then. It has too many questions, and it's too much. Well, that doesn't really make sense. And was apartheid really that bad? So we can't really laud him so much. Blah 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 blah. And the ANC isn't really that great of a party. And even if they weren't trying to kill people, blowing up stuff, how good is that? And what ultimately did did in the South African government, best I can tell, wasn't even terrorism. It was the blockade from the West, who stopped investing and stopped dealing and started condemning, and like that, as far as I can tell. And again, I'm not an expert. That had a lot more effect on it than the inept bombings of the black communists. Um, you know, uh, so yeah, it's interesting in terms of the narrative of history, and then it's self-reinforcing. Then you get the black president of America going to the black president of South Africa, and it's like, he's legitimate because I'm saying he's legitimate, and I'm legitimate because of him. And like, they all pat each other on the back and say, we're in charge, and this is why we're in charge. And you know people who can't see the details are left with that narrative, and then they have no argument. If all is Mount Rushmore, then you cannot criticize Barack Obama. If your idea of history is that, or your textbook that you had in high school, then you cannot question the official narrative, because that's the only thing that exists to you. And the official narrative is written in a way that it can't be questioned or argued with. But fortunately, there's enough other information available that one can look at the official narrative and say, it's just, no, it's not true. It's not true. And rather than say, Mandela is this horrible, terrible person, technical, but the narrative, the man in stone, is not true. It's just a man. It's just a politician. He really is just another politician. He's a mediocre person in terms of politicians. Uh, which means he has blood on his hands, because they all do. Not a record or anything like that, but that's who he really is. And all this stuff with the Stockholm Stadium full of people, that's who the government needs him to be. Not just the South African government. It's a mutually reinforcing thing, that their legitimacy is shared amongst each other. And they all realize, just like the kings of old, they knew they had to respect each other. Because if they didn't respect each other, then they would think, if I don't respect the other kings, maybe the people in my society won't respect my authority. So yeah, they have to come and kowtow to him, because they know it will happen for themselves as well if it ever comes to it. So it's a vicarious celebration of their own power and authority and legitimacy. When they go and do this, it's the same thing if they were to build a new monument to FDR, and Obama would come and give a speech. He's giving a speech about his legitimacy and legitimacy of government. Whatever he says about FDR or TR or Calvin Coolidge even. The monument to Lincoln, that's not to Lincoln. That's a monument to the federal government. It's iconography to perpetuate their own legitimacy. And Lincoln is just the form. But, it makes sense that they would pick him, but like, that's what's really going on there. And that's what's really going on in South Africa right now. So, all right, that's pretty much it. I'll talk to you later.